stand on the shores of Devil's Lake State Park in Wisconsin, and you're just met with this incredible geological contrast. It almost doesn't seem real. You've got these massive rock formations, the bluffs right overhead,
Yeah.
and then features that were, well, geologically speaking, sculpted just yesterday.
That really is the heart of it, isn't it? It's this collision of immense timescales. Devil's Lake, it's not just Wisconsin's most popular state park.
Right.
It's this place where the truly ancient Earth met the really dynamic, relatively recent power of the Ice Age.
Absolutely. And that's what we want to explore here. We've looked at documents covering the park's history, its geology, which is just stunning, the lake's ecology, the human story, and even plans for his future.
Yeah.
We're going to try and unpack the layers that make this spot so unique.
Exactly. From how the landscape was first forged, billions of years ago, and then dramatically reshaped by ice, to how people have connected with this place over millennia, and the ongoing work to understand and preserve its fragile health.
So let's dive into that geological timeline first.
Yeah.
It's just mind-boggling. You mentioned billions of years, and then just yesterday, the rock itself tells that story.
It really does.
The ridge lines of the gorge, those high points where the trails run, they're only about 16,000 years old.
Which feels ancient to us.
Right. But the foundation they sit on, that Baraboo quartzite making up the gorge walls, that's over 1.7 billion years old.
Yeah, it's staggering.
That means the ancient rock is, roughly 100,000 times older than the features shaped by the ice?
And it's fascinating how those young ridges actually got there. That's the signature of the Ice Age.
Right.
Over the last, say, 2.5 million years, these massive glaciers advanced and retreated across the upper Midwest multiple times. Their most recent activity really faded out only about 10,000 years ago.
So the ice wasn't just sitting there. It was like this colossal sculpture constantly moving.
Precisely. When a glacier advances, it just means the ice is flowing forward faster than it's melting at the front. And when it retreats, well, it's melting faster than it's flowing,
Right.
but it's still flowing, just losing ground.
And this push and pull was incredibly powerful.
Oh, immensely. It scraped away bedrock, it moved unbelievable amounts of rock and dirt, and it carved out completely new features.
Like lakes, for example.
Yes, meltwater pooling up, or ice physically blocking drainage paths. The whole landscape around there is just covered in these glacial fingerprints. You see things like kettles,
Right.
which are basically basins formed when these huge chunks of ice got buried by sediment as the glacier retreated.
Okay.
And then they slowly melted, leaving a big depression. The Johnson Ponds in the park, those are kettles.
And Devil's Lake itself, how did it end up right there in that gorge?
Well, during that last big glaciation, lobes of ice actually pushed into and blocked both ends of the gorge, north and south.
Oh, wow. Both ends.
Yeah. So it essentially acted like a giant dam for all the meltwater collecting in between. Now, there were other huge glacial lakes around, like Glacial Lake, Wisconsin. But as the ice finally pulled back for good and meltwater found ways to drain across the wider landscape, Devil's Lake remained.
Why? What kept it there?
Because a huge ridge of glacial debris, what we call a moraine, got left behind, and it effectively dammed the south end of the gorge.
Ah, okay.
All the other nearby glacial lakes eventually drained away, but Devil's Lake was trapped by that moraine. It became the only significant lake right in that area that survived the drainage.
So from billions of years and ice shaping the land, we shift to the human story, which feels just as layered, just as compelling.
It really is.
That original name, the one given by Native people, it speaks volumes about their connection, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The Ho-Chunk people, they knew it as Tamakunchukta. Now, translations seem to vary a bit, suggesting things like Sacred Lake or Spirit Lake. But the translation that really caught on, the one that stuck, was Devil's Lake.
Interesting. Why that one?
Well, it was noted, even back then, as being the most sort of sensational translation available. And, it's generally thought that maybe that evocative, slightly mysterious name actually helped attract visitors in later years, gave it some mystique.
And it did become one of Wisconsin's earliest state parks.
Correct. 1911, it was the third state park designated in Wisconsin, right after interstate and peninsula state parks.
And then the early 20th century brings this huge shift, the automobile. That changed everything for recreation, didn't it?
Oh, fundamentally. I mean, people weren't tied to the railroad schedules anymore.
Right, which had been crucial for tourism before that.
Exactly. Suddenly, individuals, families, they could just hop in their car and explore more freely on their own time. It opened up access to places like Devil's Lake in a completely new way.
And the visitor numbers just skyrocket.
They really do. Attendance apparently doubled from like 100,000 to 200,000 just between 1919 and 1924.
Wow.
By 1952, it was over 1 million visitors a year, and now over 2 million annually.
That's incredible. It really speaks to the park's draw, that mix of unique landscape and things to do.
Yeah, and historical attractions played a part too, like the chateau on the North Shore.
Oh yeah, the chateau.
Yeah.
Famous for big band concerts, dances.
Right. And apparently they still have similar concerts there sometimes, which is neat.
That's cool. And camping, of course, became huge.
Yeah.
Led to campgrounds like Northern Lights and then Quartzite in the 60s.
But the human connection isn't just about tourism or recreation. It's much deeper culturally, tied right into the natural features, those amazing bluffs.
Yeah.
They aren't just rocks, they're central to Ho-Chunk origin stories.
The tradition that describes them being formed by a great battle between thunderbirds and water spirits.
Exactly. And you can see reflections of this deep connection right there in the landscape, in the effigy mound.
Right, those aren't just random shapes.
No, not at all. They're deliberate earthworks built by ancient peoples, often reflecting their worldview, their cosmology. In the park, there's this incredible 150-foot-long bird effigy on the southeastern shore, possibly representing a birdman, which suggests maybe a blending of spiritual and human forms.
Okay.
And then down at the northern end of the lake, you find what are called lower world mounds, shapes like a bear, another unidentified animal, and maybe a water spirit or panther. Beings associated with the earth and water.
It's just a powerful reminder that these landscapes hold so many layers of meaning, way beyond just the physical geology.
Absolutely. And speaking of landscapes shaped by ice, the park also sits right next door to the Ice Age National Scenic Trail and Reserve.
Makes perfect sense given how dominant the glaciers were in creating this specific place.
Yeah, it's a natural fit.
Now, despite all its popularity, natural beauty, the lake itself, it's faced some pretty significant environmental challenges. It's not just a pristine postcard. It's a system that's had to deal with the lingering effects of human activity.
That's a really crucial point. Park staff started getting concerned around 1986. They noticed the water clarity was declining, especially late in the summer. And there was a definite increase in those unpleasant blue-green algal blooms. For a lake famous for being clear, that was a big red flag.
So what did they find was the root cause?
The main issue turned out to be something called internal loading. Essentially, it's the recycling of phosphorus that had built up over many, many years in the lake's deep water sediments.
Phosphorus?
Yeah, huge concentrations of what they call legacy phosphorus trapped down there in the lake bed muck.
So not necessarily pollution happening right now, but stuff left over from decades ago. The lake was sort of remembering past pollution.
Exactly right. See, Devil's Lake is naturally very low in nutrients. It's what's called a seepage lake, fed mostly by groundwater and rain.
Right.
Plus, its watershed is small and dominated by that nutrient-poor quartzite rock. It should be incredibly clear. But historical pollution sources dumped a lot of phosphorus into it over time.
What kind of sources are we talking about?
Well, they identified a few key ones, septic leachate and gray water from all the old resorts and cottages that used to line the shores from the late 1800s up into the 1960s.
Right. Then there was wastewater from a sanitary sewer pipe that actually broke back in the 1970s and wasn't fixed until 1982.
Oh, wow.
And also runoff from farm fields that used to be on the southwest bluff before the park bought that land in the 80s and converted it back to prairie.
So, okay, they stopped those external sources of pollution, but the problem didn't just vanish.
No, because Devil's Lake has no natural outlet stream. There's no way for that accumulated phosphorus to get flushed out of the system. So instead of leaving, it just kept cycling between the lake bed sediments and the water column.
How does that cycle actually work in the lake?
It's tied very closely to the seasons, and particularly oxygen levels in the deep water. In the summer, the lake stratifies warmer water on top, colder, denser water, the hypolimnion at the bottom.
Like layers in a cake?
Exactly. And that bottom layer, the hypolimnion, often runs out of oxygen and it becomes anoxic.
Okay.
When the sediment surface has no oxygen, the phosphorus that's chemically bound there gets released into the water just above it.
Ah, okay. So it escapes the mud. Right. Then, as the lake starts to mix again, usually in late summer or early fall, that phosphorus-rich bottom water gets circulated upwards. And that fuels the growth of algae near the surface.
Leading to the blooms that we're seeing.
Precisely. Then, later in the fall, usually around mid-October, the whole lake mixes completely during fall turnover. Everything gets oxygenated again.
And
then iron compounds, which are naturally present in the water and sediments, they reoxidize. They act like tiny magnets, basically, binding up that dissolved phosphorus again.
okay.
This locked-up phosphorus then settles back down into the sediments. It's a natural scavenging process that helps clean the water column as the lake cools down for winter.
There's also a mention of a mercury issue being connected.
Yes, that was another problem linked to the lake being overly productive because of all that phosphorus. They found high mercury concentrations in walleye, and it was traced back to the bioaccumulation of methylmercury. That's the really toxic form. It's produced by specific bacteria, sulfate reducers, that thrive in those oxygen-depleted anoxic conditions at the bottom of the lake.
So more phosphorus meant more algae, which meant more decomposition using up oxygen.
Exactly, creating more habitat for those mercury methylating bacteria. So tackling the phosphorus was key to addressing multiple issues.
So what did they decide to do? What was the solution?
The technique they chose is called hypolimnetic withdrawal.
Okay, what's that?
It basically involves installing a pipe system that uses a siphon effect gravity, essentially to draw water specifically from that deep phosphorus-rich bottom layer, the hypolimnion.
And send it out of the lake.
And send it out of the lake, yes. Downstream, somewhere where it can be handled.
Why did they pick that method over others?
Well, several reasons made it a good fit here. First, those main external pollution sources were already gone, so they weren't just treating ongoing pollution. Second, the siphon system itself is relatively inexpensive to operate because it runs on gravity. No major annual energy costs for pumping.
That makes sense.
And third, there was apparently strong public feeling against adding chemicals, like aluminum sulfate, to treat the water in Devil's Lake, given its status as an outstanding resource water. People wanted a more mechanical solution.
Okay, so when did this system go in?
It was installed back in 2002. And it's been operated most years since then. The document said 13 out of 16 years, up through 2017.
And they run it.
They specifically target late summer and early fall. That's the time when those phosphorus concentrations in the bottom water are at their absolute peak right before the lake mixes.
And is it making a difference? Is it working?
It has definitely removed a significant amount of phosphorus over the years, but the sheer volume of that legacy phosphorus locked up in the sediments is just enormous.
Right. Decades of buildup.
Exactly. The estimates are that fully addressing it, getting the lake back to a more natural state, will likely take many more years, maybe even decades, of continuing this withdrawal. It's a long-term project.
Does that pipe ever get used for anything else?
Yes, it can also be used as a flood control outlet if the lake level gets too high.
Oh, okay.
But when it's used for flood control, it generally removes less phosphorus because that might happen at times of year when the bottom water concentrations aren't at their peak, outside that late summer window.
So how do they keep tabs on the lake's health? How do they know if the withdrawal is actually working long term?
Oh, there's extensive monitoring. They collect water samples from that deep hypolimnion layer at very specific, standardized depths.
Standardized depths.
Yeah, measured from the bottom up, because the lake's surface level can fluctuate quite a bit. This makes sure they're always sampling the same critical deep water zone.
Makes sense. And what are they measuring?
They measure profiles of phosphorus, iron, and sulfate. They've been doing this since 1986, actually.
Wow, long-term data.
Very valuable data. It helps them track changes in how much phosphorus is being released from the sediments, assess that natural iron scavenging potential we talked about.
Right, the iron magnets.
Exactly. And also understand the activity of those sulfate-reducing bacteria linked to mercury. They also take core samples of the sediments themselves sometimes to look for actual changes in the phosphorus content down there.
And is there a specific schedule for this monitoring?
Yes, the recommendation is for about 8 specific sampling times spread throughout the year. They focus particularly on the seasons when clarity used to drop and blooms happened, and when all those important chemical reactions are occurring in that deep anoxic layer.
You mentioned the iron's role being important. Do they watch that closely?
Oh, absolutely critical. They pay very close attention to the ratio of iron to phosphorus, specifically the HFP molar ratio, especially around mid-September, just before turnover.
Why then?
Because they need need to ensure that ratio stays well above 2 to 1 if the available iron starts getting depleted relative to the phosphorus.
Then the natural cleanup mechanism fails.
Exactly. It significantly reduces the lake's ability to bind up that phosphorus when the water finally reoxygenates in the fall. Now, luckily, the surrounding quartzite bluffs are rich in iron oxides, so they don't expect widespread iron depletion right now, but it's a key indicator they absolutely have to track.
So if that iron level did start to drop significantly,
Then they'd have to seriously rethink the strategy. They might need to consider moving the withdrawal pipe intake to shallower water,
wow.
because at that point, the system would mostly just function as a flood control outlet. Withdrawing that deep water wouldn't be as effective for phosphorus removal anymore if the natural iron binding process wasn't working properly.
Interesting. Okay, looking ahead now, environmental education seems to be a really big part of the conversation for the park's future.
Yeah, it's seen as vital. And environmental education, it's not just about, teaching facts about birds and trees. It's more of a process across different subjects, really, helping people learn how to investigate environmental issues themselves and how to make informed decisions. The goal is really fostering responsible behavior, changing attitudes towards the natural world.
And there's this concept discussed for new interpretive center.
Yes, the vision seems to be for a space that really synthesizes all the different aspects of the park. The geology, the ecology, the deep cultural history.
Kind of bring it all together.
Exactly. Celebrate its unique features, enhance its character, but also, and this is important, embody an environmentally responsible design ethic itself.
So the building itself becomes a teaching tool.
Precisely. Demonstrating energy efficiency, using sustainable construction materials, handling stormwater responsibly, using native plants and landscaping, the whole package.
Choosing a site for something like that must be tricky.
Yeah, it involves balancing a lot of factors. You'd want it near the Ice Age Trail, obviously, for that connection. Needs easy road access, probably close to existing facilities like parking or restrooms. Ideally near significant features like maybe those effigy mounds for direct interpretation. The ground itself has to be suitable for building, they mentioned soil analysis. And of course, you want views that enhance the whole experience.
Parking. Always a challenge at a park, drawing over 2 million people a year. What's the current situation there?
Well, right now there are over 1,000 official parking stalls split between the North and South Shore areas.
Okay.
And with some overflow parking along roadsides, they can fit maybe over 1,100 vehicles on the absolute peak days.
Do those lots fill up often?
Apparently, they only tend to completely fill up on specific peak summer weekends, Saturdays and Sundays, May through August, usually between about 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Most other times, there's capacity.
So is the idea to build more parking to handle those absolute peaks?
Actually, no. The guidance from the park management specifically discourages adding more parking capacity.
Really? Why is that?
The concern is that just building more parking simply allows more people to crowd in during those already extremely busy peak times.
Putting more stress on the resources.
Exactly. Increased risk of trail erosion, beach crowding, general degradation of the natural areas from simple overuse. Plus, building more parking means removing vegetation, possibly altering landforms, and dealing with more stormwater runoff from all that pavement.
So it's less about just cramming more people in and more about shaping the visitor experience and maybe promoting stewardship.
That seems to be the direction. The design strategies talked about for a potential center really emphasize placing the building thoughtfully, considering access, views.
And maybe creating different zones.
Yeah, like maybe an active exploration area for kids, and perhaps a more quiet, reflective space for adults. Using low-impact construction, local materials where possible.
Sustainable practices.
Definitely. Incorporating renewable energy systems that are visible, educational, landscaping with low-maintenance native plants, designing versatile indoor-outdoor spaces that can be used in different ways.
It sounds like the goal is an investment that pays off not just in visitor numbers, but in building that deeper connection.
Right. Fostering a connection that encourages responsible use, makes people want to learn more, and inspires them to come back and continue engaging with the park.
It's quite something. Devil's Lake really is this place where you feel the weight of geological time meeting the power of relatively recent ice sculpting, and where that deep cultural history is literally written onto the land, but also where managing immense popularity requires this real long-term commitment to environmental health.
It's such a dynamic system, isn't it? It shows us not just the incredible force of natural processes, but also how our past actions, human actions, can leave this really long legacy, a
Yeah.
legacy that can take decades, maybe longer, to really address. It definitely highlights the complexity of what stewardship means.
When you look at Devil's Lake, you really do contemplate these immense scales, the age of the rock, the slow, painstaking journey of trying to restore a lake's health.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it, about the kind of sustained effort, the patience that's required to truly care for places shaped by such deep time and such layered human and natural history. What does it genuinely mean to be a steward for the long haul in a place like Devil's Lake?